Hello, my name is Tom Wickersham. I'm the events director for Brookline Booksmith, and I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight for Casey Sherman and Dave Wedge's Boston Strong. As with all the ugliest moments in history, it's important to face evil head on and to embrace the forces of beauty and strength that rise against it. This book does just that.
Just to give you a little more detail about our backgrounds, I'm Casey Sherman. This is Dave. I'm the short guy. He's the tall guy. This is my 8th book. I've been writing books since the early 2000s. Before that, I was a journalist for CBS News for about 20 years. I worked as a TV news producer. And I call myself the accidental author. I wasn't ever dreaming about writing books one day, and that is until I was thrust into the spotlight because of my work on one case. Tom kind of touched on it a little bit. That's the Boston Strangler case. Now, this was a personal crusade for me because my aunt, 19-year-old Mary Sullivan, was the youngest and final victim of this notorious 1960s murder spree. And I've written, as I said, 8 books, but every single book that I approach, has to have a heart. And it really is victim-centric or survivor-centric. That's the focus that I want to apply in the stories that I write. Tom mentioned one of the books that I wrote previous to this. It's called The Finest Hours. And some of you may have heard about it because Disney just shot a huge movie based on my book here in Boston and all over New England. And that's an incredibly inspirational story. It's about a Coast Guard rescue that took place off Cape Cod back in the 1950s. And to follow that book up, I was looking for a similar story that provided those unilateral or universal themes of selfless sacrifice, courage under fire, etc. And we believe we found it in Boston Strong. Dave?
Hey, Tom, thank you for that wonderful introduction. And it was one thing that Tom, I'm Dave Wedge, by the way. So one thing Tom mentioned in his little intro there, he said this is an important piece of history, and that's really what drew me to this story. That's why I wanted to do it. My background is I was a Boston College graduate, journalist for 20 years. I was a reporter at the Boston Herald for 14 years. I covered news and politics and a lot of different stories. I was in New York on 9/11. So I had some experience with covering terrorism in the past. I covered a lot of major national news stories over the years. The Wakefield office massacre back in 2000 up in at Edgewater Technology, and the Rhode Island fire, the station fire, where 100 people lost their lives. And I had a lot of opportunities over the years to do books, and I've always wanted to do a book, but I never really found the right story. And on April 15th, 2013, I was the City Hall reporter at the Boston Herald, and I was sent to the finish line after the bombs went off, and I covered the story right through to the end. And when Watertown happened, I was sent out in the middle of the night after Sean Collier was shot in Cambridge, and I started heading to that scene. And as I was on my way there, the news desk told me that there was something going on in Watertown, and they diverted me. So I was sent into Watertown and arrived there shortly after the bullets stopped flying, and I parked my car. My car actually ended up in the crime scene, and I was stuck there, and I stayed there for the rest of the night and through the next night until they actually caught Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, and his brother was killed. So after that happened, I mentioned 9/11. I had a good friend of mine who was a police officer that I met on 9/11, a guy named Chris Hunt. And he worked at the 1st Precinct, which is the closest one to the Twin Towers. And I met him when I was covering the story for the Herald, and we became great friends. And we get together annually. He comes up, I come down there. We go to anniversaries together and things like that. When this happened, one of the first texts that I got was from Chris, and he said, "Take good notes. You're going to have to write a book about this." And it never really struck me until that moment that this was the story that I really wanted to tell. And when Casey and I touched base about it, I told him I was thinking about it, and he had already been thinking about it, and it ended up that it was a perfect partnership.
Right. Yeah, and for my perspective, this was the last book I wanted to write, to be quite honest, because as a writer and even as a journalist, we benefit from historical perspective. there has to be some time that elapses before we really understand what the true story really is. And everything with this story, it was so big, and it was happening in real time, and it was very, I was very nervous to take on this project because it had to be told right. And thank God that Dave and I, we've been friends for well over 10 years, and I knew Dave was the best boots on the ground reporter in this city. And if I was going to write it with somebody, it had to have that kind of newsy feel to it, but it also had to have the breadth and depth of a real strong narrative. And I remember that there were several publishers and people in the media in Boston at the time, because of my background writing about some of the biggest criminal cases in the city's history. They said, well, if it's going to be a book, it has to be written by Casey Sherman. I said, thanks. I don't want to do this. But I felt like I was recruited to do it. Fortunately, Dave was having the same ideas. And as Dave said, it's been a great collaboration. And when publishers approached the both of us, they asked, what was our approach, or maybe what was our theme? And, were we going to focus heavily on the Tsarnaev brothers? Was that our story? And I said, I don't want to write that story. That story will be told, and we'll tell it through the course of the book, but our focus and our application and our approach is about these incredible stories of a city coming together under the smoke, under the fire, under, the screams really, and how a city really responds. And you never know how you're going to respond until the bomb does hit. And from our perspective, and we've covered a lot of different stories from around the country, but we've never seen a response like the city responded. And over the course of well over a year, Dave and I really embedded ourselves with these stories and really with the survivors. We spent as much time as we could, probably more time than any other journalist in Boston, with a lot of these survivors, getting to know them, not just in a impersonal way, by just interviewing them once. No, we spent days, months with these folks, and we got their high points and we got their low points. And what we found were very similar themes throughout the course of the book, of courage, of motivation, of resiliency. We were honored and humbled to talk to as many people as we did, and to have the honor of telling this story in the book.
I think from there, I'll turn towards probably one of the most important moments for us that helped us really develop this book, and that was we were invited to go on an incredible trip to France with 100 of the survivors and their relatives. This was in November 2013, so many of these folks were still in the full recovery mode. Many were still injured and still trying to come back from what had happened to them. And there was a lot of apprehension on folks to go on this trip. Casey can touch on that piece when I give the mic back to him. But there's a company in Boston called Vantage Travel, and the gentleman who owns that knew Carlos Arredondo, the man in the cowboy hat. And he knew Carlos because Carlos had lost two of his sons. One son died in Afghanistan, and one son committed suicide. And Carlos was very active in the Wounded Warriors and the Gold Star Families programs. And Vantage Travel had done some trips for those folks, and Carlos actually went on one. So when the marathon bombing happened, the owner of Vantage, it's
Hank Lewis.
Hank Lewis and his wife were watching on TV, and he said, what, that's Carlos. He's been on our trips. And they thought about how they could help, and they said, we've got to help Carlos and the people like him. And they donated this trip to these survivors, and it was $500,000, and it was an absolutely incredible experience. We were the only journalists that were invited to go on it, and we describe it in the book as floating therapy. And really what happened was these folks were taken away from Boston, away from everything, put on a ship in France, and they went on a river cruise through wine country. They went toward ancient churches. They went and saw some of the most amazing sights in cities like Lyon and Avignon and Châteauneuf-du-Pape. And they really bonded. And it was amazing for us to witness. And Casey will tell you a little bit about one of the most amazing developments on the trip, which involved Carlos Arredondo.
Sure. Thanks, Dave. Yeah, this was an amazing trip, and Dave hit the nail on the head. It was floating therapy for these folks. Some of them knew each other before the cruise, and they'd only known each other through different survivor events or maybe in the hospital. But by the time they got on the ship, they recognized faces. You know, were you in my hospital ward, or didn't I see you on Boylston Street? And we just observed all these relationships and these friendships really forging over time. And all of the survivors on that ship had a common way to communicate. Everybody spoke English. Everybody had that Boston connection. There was one couple that didn't, and that was the mother and father of Ling Lu, the Boston University graduate student who was killed on Boylston Street. But they wanted to come on this trip, and they were searching for something tangible, a memory or somebody that may have seen their daughter on Boylston Street. And it really broke our hearts when we met them, because they had no way to really communicate any questions with anybody else on the trip. And they brought a translator with them. Translator didn't speak English either, so that was a problem for everybody, including us. But you could see literally the physical pain that Ling Lu's father and mother had from the very first moment they got on that ship. I mean, it just broke our hearts, because we knew their lives had been shattered, and we could see it on their faces. Well, Dave mentioned Carlos. Everybody has kind of heard the heroic Carlos story of wheeling Jeff Bowman to the ambulance and getting him the proper care that he needed. But there's another story that we tell in this book, and we didn't really know Carlos before the trip. And Carlos had done a lot of press, so we didn't really know what to think of him when we got there. Was he somebody who loved the media and was really attracted to that? And maybe we thought that before the trip, but when we got to watch him really work with all of these families, it was an amazing thing to see, because Carlos and Ling Lu's father, they started to bond. And they spoke a common language, and that was a common language of loss. Carlos had lost two sons, one in Iraq and one who had taken his life shortly thereafter. And over the course of several days, these two men really started to, as I said, communicate, bond. You could see a smile cracking on the sides of the mouth of Ling Lu's father, and he really began to at least enjoy himself and talk about how he missed his daughter. And there was some music being played on the ship, and the Ling Lu's father went to go listen to it. The mother couldn't. And it was a cellist playing, and Ling Lu loved to play the cello, and she didn't want to hear that type of music if it wasn't coming from her daughter. But the dad did, and the dad did bond with Carlos and a lot of other people on this ship. And it was an incredible moment in time, this trip. There's another brief story that I'll mention that we have in the book, talking about serendipity and how people that saved lives on Boylston Street may never have seen the people that they saved again. Well, there was one gentleman on the cruise, Alan Starr. We write about him in the book. Not a guy that you'd ever expect to be at the finish line of the marathon. He's a rock and roll guy. He loves heavy metal bands. He loves guitar. And he was just there to watch a friend who had run for the first time. Alan had never been at the finish line. The bomb goes off in front of Marathon Sports, in the smoke, in the debris, in the chaos. And Alan is unhurt, besides he can't hear, and he sees this young woman who's covered in soot and blood, and he knows she's severely hurt. Nobody's helping her because people are helping everybody else. So he's the closest to her. He picks her up. He applies a tourniquet to her body, to her leg, and carries her to the medical tent, and knows that she's safe, and then he goes back and tries to help other people. So when we get to the cruise, and again, people are kind of, letting their stories evolve over the first couple of days. And Alan is sitting at dinner, and he's relaying the story of why he's on the cruise, why he was invited. And he's describing just what I described to you. And after the end of the story, he says, I don't know who she was. I'll never see her again, and I just hope she's okay. There was a girl at his table. She was blonde, and she was listening to that story. She didn't say anything at the dinner. later at the lounge, she asked Alan a couple more questions, and he answered, and she says, "That was me you saved." You know, those are the types of stories, these unsung heroes that we found everywhere we looked in this case, and it really, as I said, it was quite inspiring. And to be quite honest, it was also a little nerve-wracking, as Dave touched on, for the survivors, because it was a very high-profile trip, and a lot of them felt we're all in one place at one time. Is there a terrorist group out there that wants to finish the job? Now, that threat became very real, obviously, this year with the attack at Charlie Hebdo, that there were cells in the Paris area in France, and they very well could have been monitoring, the movements of these survivors during the course of those 11 days. So people were quite nervous.
I'll address a little bit the title of the book, Boston Strong. It's a commonly used term now. It's some people would say even overused, and we wrestled a lot with how to name our book, and ultimately we settled on Boston Strong because we just felt there was nothing else that we could call it. It was the stories that, such as Casey just described, it's just such a fitting term for that. And one more small story from the ship that kind of exhibits that sentiment. Jeff Bauman, who actually testified in the courtroom today. He's the young man who lost lost both his legs. The famous picture, he was rescued by Carlos Arredondo, and just an amazing guy. He was on the ship with us in France, and there's a moment that we describe in the book where another woman that's one of the folks in our book, Michelle LaRue, who was injured. She nearly lost her leg, nearly lost her arm, and she was having a hard time one night on the ship, and we were in the lounge, and she went over to talk to Jeff, and she just wanted to have a conversation with him, see how he was doing, because Jeff he's did a lot of media, he's always out there, so everyone assumes Jeff is okay, and Michelle just wanted to kind of talk to Jeff and ask how he was doing, and Jeff was on the dance floor in his wheelchair, and he was spinning around in his wheelchair and dancing and having fun, and Michelle went over to him, and they had a little embrace, and Michelle asked how he was doing. He said he was doing all right. He said, "How are you doing?" And he put his hand on Michelle's wound, and just instinctively. And Michelle doesn't like when anyone does that, but because it was Jeff, it was okay. And Jeff just told her it's going to be all right. He said, "If I could have taken that for everyone, I would have." And Michelle had to leave at that point and go back to her room and just had herself a good cry. But for a guy like that to have that sort of attitude and fortitude, where I would take this for everybody after what he's been through, that's what Boston Strong is all about.
And that's just a really poignant, organic moment that we were able to observe through the course of research and writing this book. Dave mentioned Michelle. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the people that you're going to get to know in this book. Michelle LaRue, an amazing young woman who grew up in Maine, was an equestrian in high school, very accomplished horse rider in college as well, but she wasn't a runner. Very athletic. Her mom ran, but her boyfriend Brian was a runner. In fact, he was running his 10th Boston Marathon at the time, and we always laugh because we used to say, thank God there was a course for Brian to follow, because Brian would get lost in this store very easily. He's got no sense of direction, so the fact that he could make it 26 miles and actually cross the finish line is a feat and victory in itself. And Brian crossed the finish line. Michelle was able to see that. It was the first time at the finish line herself, cheers Brian on, and moments later the bomb goes off, and she's right in front of Marathon Sports. There was some video footage that was released to the media yesterday following the first day of testimony at the trial, which Dave and I were both at. It shows the inside of Marathon Sports and many of the victims literally falling into the store. Michelle is one of those victims, and her heroes, who are all store workers, immediately started to apply tourniquets. And I mean, it's amazing how quickly they went from being in sheer panic to, okay, somebody's hurt, we have to help them. Now, Michelle was severely hurt, her leg, her arm, and her ear, but she still somehow kept her sense of humor as she's actually being wheeled into an ambulance and being driven to Faulkner Hospital at the time. She was abruptly shaken, I should say, in the ambulance, and because they were driving, the ambulance driver was going very fast, and the only thing she could think of, which is what we all think when we drive up any of these roads in the winter, those goddamn Massachusetts potholes. And that was her line of thought as she was, slipping in and out of consciousness. Fortunately, she was saved. And it's amazing that every single survivor that made it to a hospital lived. That is incredible. That probably wouldn't happen in any other American city, but because the hospitals here were trained for this, were trained for mass casualty, they were able to save so many lives. I'm going to talk a little bit more about one other survivor that we wrote about in the book, and her name is Mary Daniel. Now, Mary Daniel is the epitome of the American dream. She was born in Haiti, came over here as a high school student, went to Brockton High School, which Dave is a proud alumni of as well. Incredibly smart, went to University of Massachusetts, studied pre-med, and went to medical school. And she lived here in Boston with her husband and her 5-year-old daughter. She had never been to the marathon before, and it's early spring. It's Marathon Monday. Mary is studying for her medical boards, but her eyes are glazing over. She can't deal with it anymore. She wants to get out. It's a little warm out. She feels like her daughter, who she just given a sugary cereal to that morning, needed some fresh air. And the TV was playing on in the background. It was all Boston Marathon coverage. So she thought, you know what? We're going to go here. It looks like a lot of fun. And then she looked at her daughter again, and that little girl, Sierra, she's bouncing off all the walls because she just had so much energy. And Mary thought, you know what? I may lose my daughter in the crowd, but I'd like to go. So she made a decision to leave her little daughter with her husband. And she ends up at right in front of Marathon Sports, very close to Michelle LaRue. And again, the bomb goes off. And Mary ends up on her back on the sidewalk of Boylston Street. Now, she's medically trained, and so she can see the injuries to her body, and she knows how severe it is. And it's amazing, and she's an amazing young woman. In 2010, she went back to her native Haiti after the earthquakes and mended as many people as she could. And there were dozens of amputees after the Haiti earthquake, very similar to what happened here in Boston. And she's seeing many of the same injuries that she saw in Haiti, and she felt she couldn't help. Somebody actually had to help her. And the only thing she can think about as she's lying on Boylston Street is, thank God I didn't bring my daughter here, because my daughter would be killed. And then the second thing she thought was, am I going to live? Is my daughter going to grow up without a mom? Fortunately, she was the first survivor taken and admitted to Mass General, and she lost a leg. But she kept her life, and now, she is an incredible young mother for this daughter that's going to need her for the rest of her life, and Mary's going to need her as well. And Mary has used this, as many of the survivors, and Dave is going to talk about this, as motivation to do things that they've never done before. Mary's a hand cyclist now. Mary is running races all over the country and using, as I said, the tragedy in her life to do things that she never thought possible.
Again, the stories of resilience is really what drew us to this story. And another example of that resilience is a woman named Sabrina Della Russo. Sabrina lives in the North End, and she was at the marathon with her friends. One of her best friends is Roseanne Sedoya, who lost a leg in the bombing. They were at Forum that day. And there was a group of them. They were all there together. Sabrina was maybe as far from me to you away from Roseanne that day. And Roseanne lost a leg. People around her were killed. Other people around them lost limbs. Sabrina somehow miraculously did not lose any limbs. She had some shrapnel wounds. She had some temporary hearing damage. And she suffered a traumatic brain injury. And she's had some, PTSD and a lot of those issues. But physically, she was spared the worst that a lot of the people around her were. She's got tremendous survivor's guilt because of that. It's something she struggles with every day. Again, like Michelle, Sabrina was never a runner. Roseanne was. Last year, for the anniversary, and our story takes you from the day of the bombing through the first anniversary, Sabrina made a decision that she was going to run for Roseanne. And even that was something that Sabrina struggled with because she felt bad that Roseanne couldn't run with her. But in the end, she decided she was going to do it because she knew that her and her friends that ran for Roseanne could raise some money, and the money is desperately needed by a lot of these survivors, especially the amputees. People talk about the One Fund, and the One Fund was an incredible thing, and it was very generous, and a lot of people got a lot of money out of that, but it's not enough, and it'll never be enough. Those prosthetic legs are very, very expensive. They can be up to $100,000, and the technology is getting better every day, and that technology is expensive, but it also improves their quality of life tremendously. So Sabrina made that decision to do that. Michelle LaRue, another one, as Casey explained, she was never a runner before. Her mom was a runner. Her mom passed away 10 years ago. And Michelle is now training to run her first marathon this year. And she's going to run it with Brian and Sabrina. And Sabrina and Michelle met on the cruise to France. So there's all these stories that we were able to come up with of just incredible resiliency. And one last person that I'll mention that we talk about extensively in the book is Mayor Menino. And no one embodied Boston Strong to me more than Mayor Menino. I'd covered him for 12 years at the time for the Boston Herald, and he was, he's a fun guy to cover. He was, as you guys all know, they called him Mumbles, and he was always putting his foot in his mouth and all that. But he was like, he's like your old uncle that would crack jokes and be kind of corny, and you'd laugh at him. But deep down inside, Mayor Menino has a very good heart, and he loves this city. No one loved this city more than Tom Menino. And that day, he was in the hospital. He had a broken leg, and we now know that he was a lot sicker than he let on. He probably knew he had cancer at that point, and he made a decision. He checked himself out of the hospital to be with the people and to lead this city, and he led admirably. And that day in the church, when President Obama was here and Governor Patrick, and they spoke to the service and to the country on national TV, he stood up out of that wheelchair, and that to me is one of the most iconic moments in Boston's history. He stood up literally for the city, and he was there for us when we needed him, and that's Boston Strong.
Yeah, and such an indelible image in the city's history. Another person that you're going to meet, and I think know a lot better through the pages of this book, is MIT police officer Sean Collier. Sean gets forgotten a little bit in the coverage of the Boston Marathon bombing because so much of the attention is focused on what happened on Boylston Street. Sean was murdered several days later on a routine patrol at MIT. And we had the opportunity to meet Sean's family and spend a lot of time with them. And I remember Dave and we sat with the family on a beautiful Saturday afternoon in the fall at their home in Wilmington. And Sean grew up in kind of a Brady Bunch style family. He had a stepfather with 2 kids, and mom had three kids, and they'd all been living under one roof for about 15 years, and they were about as close a family as you could possibly find. And the family, the only time they'd seen each other really on the past few months is to honor Sean at all these various police organizational events, etc. So we sat down with the family, and the first words out of our mouths to them was, we don't want to hear about Officer Sean today because we've read about him. We want to hear about Sean the son, Sean the brother, Sean the pain in the ass, Sean the guy who loved music and loved cars. And we wanted to really understand who Sean was. And it was amazing to see all of the stories that just came out organically from his siblings and his parents, and they're sharing stories, and suddenly they're laughing together and they're crying together. But through the course of that afternoon and other times that we've been with them, we found a young man who was incredible, just an incredibly compassionate police officer who had that compassion along with the responsibility of his position and his badge. Sean worked at MIT, and one of Sean's jobs as an MIT police officer was to clear the area of any homeless people, during the winter and the summer, etc. Sean hated that. Sean didn't want to do that, especially when it was cold outside. When Sean would get the order, this person is sleeping on a grate in front of this building, you have to have him move along. Sean would go up to that homeless person who he knew by name, and he would say, Jack, I have to get you out of here, but go to the library. There's the door open in the back. Go downstairs, sleep tonight, but you have to get out of there by like 7 because, I'll get in trouble. And he was just this incredibly compassionate young man who also was very charitable. At 15, he started to donate to the Jimmy Fund, and we found out from his mother that he loved Care Bears. He loved the American flag, and he always wanted to protect people. He wanted to be a police officer from the time he was 5 years old, and he got that opportunity. And unfortunately, he was executed, and there's no other nicer way to say it. He was absolutely assassinated by the Tsarnaev brothers, who admitted their guilt to the crime yesterday in court. And what we found out, a lot of the things, being journalists, we have to dig as well. We're going to tell these incredible stories, but we also have to talk about the cause and effect of some decisions that were made during the course of the investigation. And, much has been talked about in terms of the FBI's relationship with local law enforcement during the manhunt. And it's been presented to the public as, this was a great relationship, very collaborative. It was anything but what it seemed. Local law enforcement had no reason to be comfortable with when the federal agency took over the case. They felt like they weren't doing the right job. And there was one moment in the course of that week as law enforcement is gathering information and photographs and cell phone videos and surveillance images. Well, the FBI had the photographs of what they call Black Hat and White Hat, the Tsarnaev brothers, the Wednesday after the bombing. And the FBI had a meeting with then Commissioner Ed Davis, and Ed Davis says, you have those pictures, I want those out. I want those out into the public, because one of the things we call, the eventual capture of Dzhokhar, the greatest citizens arrest in American history, because everybody played a role in it. Everybody pushed their faces out on social media, grandmothers, kids. Everybody wanted to find these guys. And the FBI would not release those images because they were worried about the backlash with public relations. A couple days before, there was a image that showed up on the cover of the New York Post, and it labeled 2 innocent guys the bagmen or bagmen. And the FBI was so worried about, that, they weren't thinking about finding these guys. And Ed Davis said, this is my bleeping city, much like David Ortiz did. I want those photos up. Well, they hold those photos for another 24 hours. Sean Collier goes on patrol. Sean Collier is killed. We fervently believe that Sean would still be alive today if those photos were released 24 hours earlier.
So I think we've given you a nice thumbnail of what's in the book, and we think that you'll find a lot of these stories difficult to read at times, but I think ultimately there's a lot of heroism and resilience that will really be inspiring to you. So with that, I think we'll take some questions.
Sure.
If anyone has any questions. Go ahead. Hi.
If I can just introduce myself too.
Sure.
I'm Christine Goldman. And,
Hi, Christine.
I've read this cover to cover as soon as I could. It's an outstanding book. I really appreciate all that you've written, especially about the background of the Tsarnaev family.
Yeah.
I found that very informative and really, well, first let me just say that I'm a Boston Marathon runner. I qualify every year, run 7 Boston Marathons. And I've joined the Martin Richard Foundation, so Team MR8, Martin
Great.
Richard.
Right.
And so we raise money and try to spread Martin's message of no more hurting people, peace. And I think through all this, trying to reconcile Martin's message with the evil deed that's been done. It's very hard. I find myself, my family was greatly affected. I didn't make it home that day in time. I took the tea home, and when I came underground, I've put the numbers together, and that's when the bomb went off. It's because it was taking forever for the tea to get above ground. And when I got above ground at BU, that's when the ambulances were racing towards the marathon, and I knew, okay, someone must have had a heart attack, something's wrong here.
Yeah.
And by the time I did get home, my family was just absolutely a mess, particularly my husband, who's supposed to be the strength, the rock of the family. So it took a long time for every one of us in this city to, neighborhood children were afraid during the lockdown, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
So in the course of my running and praying, every time I get from BU, where I say a prayer for the victims, I run around to MIT, I say a prayer for Sean. It keep going, and that's the Shell station where the carjacking happened. That's where all these memories are, and I think all of that led me to join MRA. As a qualified runner, you don't think you can do both, but I don't need to raise money for Martin. I do it from my heart, and I want to, and I'm proud to be part of that. But I keep finding myself being so angry because I'm supposed to be spreading this message of peace, and this gorgeous, beautiful boy and his amazing, amazing family who've given me his picture to run with. But I've never been afraid. How dare you?
Yeah.
How dare you you came to this country, let me get this straight here. You became a citizen. You tried to make it through the American way. My own father is an immigrant, and it turns out he was Bill Richards' professor at Bridgewater State, where I grew up.
Small world.
Yeah, and so we're all connected.
Yeah.
We're all connected. He said, what's your father's name? I said, Vahe Mardanyan. Oh, I had him in chemistry, yeah.
Wow.
So we're all connected. And what I just can't, I need someone to help me wrap my head around. Why do you come to this country, this land of opportunity? You're at UMass Dartmouth. That's amazing. You can become an engineer. You're obviously a smart young boy. Why? The marathon is the happiest place for adults in the world, I can tell you. Crossing that finish line is it's like Christmas and birthday all in a row. And it makes, I know we're all talking about the same thing, but your book was wonderful to me because it gave me a sense of, I understand these people came from a war-torn culture. I understand they were disillusioned when you get to be a boxer. But what's the switch that happens going from upsetness and disappointment to becoming killers? If you can help us learn that, I would greatly appreciate it.
No, and that's a great question. It's something we wrestled with through the research of this book. We felt like we had to go deeply into the Tsarnaev story to understand them, but not to provide them any solace for their murderous acts. And it's amazing, Dave, as a journalist, he was on the front lines dealing with a lot of these protesters at various stages of the investigation who were claiming this is a false flag operation, this is a U.S. government plot, nobody, all the injuries are fake, these kind of crazy things. Well, fortunately, the defense came out yesterday and said, no, they did it. They did it. So, that whole argument of these lunatic crazies is null and void. It always was, but now, they have nothing to fall back on. But, we found out that, to your point, Tamerlan Tsarnaev, he didn't come over here as a jihadist, neither did his brother Dzhokhar. After 9/11, their mother, who we think is the Lady Macbeth in this whole tragedy, she became radicalized. She became, she had a very heavy influence over her son, and that is because she was losing her relationship with her own husband. And she was losing that, she was always the most influential person in the entire household. Finally, the husband had enough. He went back to Dagestan or Chechnya or wherever he was. She stayed, and she just spread her influence over her son. And Tamerlan at the time he was a nightclub kid. He was a knucklehead. just like 1,000 other college kids or would-be's out in this city any day. And she was worried that he was, not being married to a Muslim woman, or that whole thing. She starts to read the Quran with Tamerlan, starts to feed him this jihadist propaganda. He falls right into that trap. And, much has been talked about, well, was he self-radicalized only on the internet? No, he went to Dagestan. He actually studied under what could possibly be 3 different jihadists. He learned the tools of the trade. He brought those back. And did he influence his younger brother? Sure. I'm influenced by my brother as well. But Dzhokhar was a 19-year-old adult. And we hate when we hear people say, this kid who's on trial. He's not a kid. He's an adult. Martin Richard, he was a kid. Jane Richard, she was a kid. Noah, the little boy, Rebecca Gregory's 5-year-old son, he's a kid. Dzhokhar was an adult. He made an adult decision to ruin the lives of hundreds of people, thousands of people, if you really think about it. And it's interesting, seeing him walk into the courtroom yesterday, very nonchalant. The defense is now saying he was influenced by his brother. We want to keep him off death row. But then you hear the testimony of these incredibly courageous survivors who get up there without limbs, without children, and they talk about what they'd gone through, and he's just sitting there without a care in the world. He could care less. And I want the jury to look at that. I want the jury to see his demeanor in the courtroom, because when it's time to decide his ultimate fate, they have to make that decision.
I would just add one broader point to the whole war on terror. I mentioned I was at 9/11, and I was there at Ground Zero when President Bush was on top of the pile with the megaphone and said, "We're going to get them," and that sort of stuff. And he made an incredible statement at that time that was very prophetic, and I think it was lost on the American people at the time. He said, "We're at war. Make no mistake, we're at war, and this is a war that knows no battlefield. It knows no country. It's a war of ideology," and that's what's going on here. That's the war that these brothers were fighting. They were fighting an ideological war, and they're just much like the 9/11 hijackers. They were young, disillusioned young men that took what's happened in their own countries and turned that hatred on the country that extended their very hand to them, and it's despicable.
I do want to say, I have no idea what went on in these people's heads. But you have to think about them seeing for almost 10 years bombings that we did for whatever reason. We went day after day after day, 200,000 Iraqis they think were killed. These are Muslims, and they had their problems, and they did a terrible, terrible thing. But I just wonder, day after day, that's what they saw. And they have the seeds in them to do terrible things. But if you try to think, what's been going on here for a decade? All the people are seeing. Right starting in when they began to invade Afghanistan in 2002. Bombing after bombing, and all these innocent people who've been killed. I just think it must make some people absolutely crazy. And they were crazy, but I just trying to imagine what things looked like to them. And they may have been, I have no idea what's going through their minds, but you just try to think, okay, they grew up in this atmosphere of reading things that were happening to Muslims all over the world because of our bombing.
I have to say, after reading Casey and Dave's book and connecting the murder in Waltham showed me that they just want to kill. They were disillusioned. He couldn't become a boxer. He already had this excuse in his mind that you can go do this in the name of. That's why President Joe Biden, Vice President Biden at the MIT ceremony for Sean Collier called them knockoff jihadists. Why the word knockoff? Because they said it very well. The mother implanted, hey, you now have to do this, now have to do this. And when everything is going south, you're gonna just feel good because violence felt good to them. That was their way. And yes, I agree, the background is set. They're not having a very nice life over there, and they came over for a better life. But they continually couldn't get it going. And so they use this means of, aha, now I'm somebody.
And not only, you know, they couldn't get it going, but they were given every opportunity to get it going. You know, and again, take the political, I understand what you're saying. You know, you can try to take the political debate out of it a little bit. You know, their personal stories, you know, whether or not, you know, the political landscape is what it is, and there is, you know, certainly enough blame to be thrown around, you know, any country that's involved with what's happening out there, including our own. But this family was given extended, you know, from benefits to, you know, college, money for college, you know, benefits that, or, you know, people that were born here don't get. You know, they were given, you know, the streets were somewhat paved in gold for the Tsarnaev family, you know, to better themselves. They could never get it going. They were, you know, incredibly frustrated, but they always tried to take the easy way. That was the theme that we found with this particular family. You know, that family doesn't do the right thing. 1,000 other immigrant families from all over the world come to this state. They do the right thing. You know, they are valedictorians of their class. They are doctors and lawyers and you know, want to help people, and they're Americans now. You know, this family always seemed to always want to, you know, take the shortcut to the promised land, and when that shortcut was denied to them, they got angry, and then they got violent.
Did anyone ever backtrack as to why they didn't investigate those Waltham?
They did.
Killings.
They did investigate. They
And
came
connect
up with
the
this.
dots.
Yeah, well, yeah, and then that's, you know, it's always tough to play our, you know, Monday morning quarterback in an investigation, but this was such an easy connection. You know, they, you know, Tamerlan and Tsarnaev, look at the date that the murders happened on, September 11, 2011. Tamerlan Tsarnaev is one of the victim's closest Muslim friends, never even questioned by investigators. He's the only friend that doesn't show up to the funeral. And then months later, he just disappears. He goes over to Dagestan. And, you know, the constant, you know, dropping of the ball on the federal level is really frustrating. And again, maybe it wouldn't have prevented what happened on Boylston Street, but again, it certainly could have prevented the murder of Sean Collier. Sir, you had a question?
Well, I'm curious whether in your meetings you've had a lot of exposure to the people who were victims, what sort of views they have about appropriate punishment.
That's a great question.
Well, the way I like to describe it is that they can be divided into three categories. There's a group of folks that have just completely tuned out. They've moved on with their life. They don't want to deal with it. They want to just pretend it didn't happen. They may be even in denial. And that's a completely understandable reaction. Then there's a group of folks that are monitoring it but not getting completely immersed in it, and they kind of want to see what happens, and they don't have really strong feelings, but they want to make sure justice is served, whatever the jury decides. And then there's a group that's very vengeful and very angry, and they want him put to death. And the survivors range on that spectrum. All the ones that we've spoken to, and it's kind of fascinating to see which ones feel which way. And there's really no wrong answer. You know, it's a very personal thing. You know, the death penalty itself is a very personal thing. And these folks certainly have every right in the world to be filled with vengeance. But some of them are, you know, a guy like Colton Kilgore, who was, Casey mentioned a little boy Noah, the little 5-year-old who was injured. Colton Kilgore was his uncle,
Yep.
right? It's his uncle. Colton's a devout Christian, one of the most salt of the earth people you'll ever meet. And he told me last night, he said, I just can't hate him. I just can't. You know, and this guy, he said to me, he said, this guy tried to kill my family. He said, but if I'm Christian and I believe what I believe, I have to find a way to forgive him. So there are people like that, but then there's other folks that want to see this guy rot in hell. So, and I think they're all acceptable responses.
I would say the only thing that they do agree on is that the trial should have happened here in Boston. There was a lot of back and forth. The defense was trying to get a change of venue because they didn't think they could seat a jury here in the city. Now the survivors, that we've all spoken to, they said it has to be in Boston. We don't want the inconvenience of having to get on a plane to Colorado and just be put through that trauma again, just to sit there. We want the opportunity to go or not to go. And many of them are using that. Some people are going to be there every day. Some people will never go to the courthouse. Other folks will go when they feel like they need to, be a part of it. So that is one of the, the kind of the consolidated agreement that many of them do have.
And just one last thing to add to that. That's the way this whole thing has worked. The cruise and now the trial, it's a support network. These folks that have all been harmed by this, and there was 268 or so folks that were injured. There was 4 people who lost their lives. And then there was anywhere, depending on what you count, 1,000 to 10,000 people that was directly impacted, that were in those couple of blocks, if not more than that. And all these people lean on each other. They do things like you're doing. They join MR8. They run for charity. Heather Abbott's got a foundation. There's a lot of different causes that folks have aligned themselves with, and that's the way that they get through these horrible, dark moments, is by leaning on each other for strength, and that's what it's really all about. Anyone else?
Do you think that that the trial, that this is going to be appealed then on the basis that it was held in Boston rather than, I don't mean it would be in Colorado, but in Lowell or somewhere that isn't Boston? I just see a big appeal ahead no matter what happens.
No, I don't think so. I think that the judge handled that appropriately. They would have had to have proven that he couldn't get a fair trial here in Boston. And that hasn't been proven. There's no cameras in the courtroom. There's no, the media would be just as prevalent if it was in South Africa as if it was here in Boston. So I don't think there's going to be any grounds for appeal there. I think the judge, he gave them, they had, I think, 3 or 4 different motions that they had full hearings on. That's why the jury selection took so long. They kept having hearings on moving the trial. So I think they covered on that.
Can I make a prediction?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
We're both
Sorry,
positive
but-
they're going to appeal.
Well,
Well,
he's obviously going to appeal.
Yeah.
I mean, if he
But
gets a
it's
death penalty, his
success-
appeal's
Nah,
going
it's
forever.
not-
If he's sentenced to die, there'll be an appeal.
He will
Of
appeal.
course.
Yeah, he'll appeal on that grounds.
If he's
That'll be
not,
one of them,
then there
but
won't.
that'll be one of many. I'm sure there'll be, they'll find some errors that were committed by the judge. Some maybe errors in seating the jury, maybe errors in testimony that went too far that the judge didn't rein in. There's a myriad ways they can appeal, as any attorney will tell you, but that doesn't mean it's justified.
Just if I could ask you one more thing about this. At least on the radio, the reports I've heard that it seems as if, that the defense lawyers would have, pled guilty or whatever if they were given life without parole. Why do you think, or do you have any sense about the dynamics there, in terms of just having to go through the whole trial in a certain way,
Right.
rather than making that kind of deal?
Well, first of all, I think that the defense chose to admit guilt yesterday because there's just an insurmountable amount of evidence that ties both brothers to all of the murders and all of the carnage on Boylston Street and in Cambridge and in Watertown. This is a death penalty case at this point. And again, I think what the defense is going to try to do is, they mentioned it yesterday, that Jokar, they claim, was under the spell of a brother who was incredibly domineering for a number of different reasons: culture, age, and what they call the sheer force of Tamerlan Tsarnaev's personality. Now, that being said, to hear and to see the witnesses and the survivors get up, as they've done very courageously in the courthouse, and just explain and describe what they went through. and they don't get hysterical. They do break down when the emotions do get high, and everybody's breaking down. You're not human if you don't hear this and feel your heart breaking with every word they say. And then you look at Dzhokhar Tsarnaev sitting at the defense table without a care in the world, completely remorseless, at least outwardly, to the jury, to everybody in the courthouse. Colton Kilgore, who Dave just mentioned, his video was shown for the first time in court yesterday. He was the only person to actually take videotape from within the first bombing. Now, Dave and I met Colton on the cruise. He's become a real asset to us and a friend. We actually have photographs from that videotape in the book. And as Colton was describing his video and what he saw and what he experienced, Dzhokhar, he told us last night, kept looking at him and looking away, looking at him and looking away. And Colton looked right at him. And again, Colton said to us he couldn't hate him, but he didn't want to look away from him as well either. He wanted to stare him in the eyes and explain what he'd done. So, okay, well, I can say, on behalf of Dave, thank you very much for coming out on a lousy winter night, the winter that'll never end. But, we feel very proud and very humble to be able to tell this story. And it's a story that's going to evolve over time. Dave and I are at the trial as much as we can be, and we'll do an update on the book after the trial and, through the years to come, because there are all sorts of questions that still need to be answered. Tamerlan Tsarnaev's wife, what did she know? What didn't she know? The role of the FBI, how is that all going to evolve? It's we're just as interested and fascinated as anybody to find, the ultimate truth, if there ever is one.
I'd just like to say thank you to Tom and Brookline Booksmith for hosting this event, and thank you all for coming out. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you.